Good morning. Some late news. Last night, the Senate approved a $1.1 trillion spending bill. It will fund the government through next September. Bottom line, no government shutdown this year or perhaps next as well. But let's get to our big story, the Senate report on what some call torture, what others call enhanced interrogation techniques. The report, put together by Senate Democrats on the Intelligence Committee, it's a detailed and in some cases shocking indictment of the methods used to interrogate detainees. There's no shortage of critics of what the CIA did, and there has been no more forceful defender of the tactics than our first guest, former Vice President Dick Cheney. So let's get right to it. Vice President Cheney, welcome back to Meet the President.
Morning, Chuck. It's good to be back.
Well, let me start with quoting you. You said earlier this week, torture was something that was very carefully avoided. It implies that you have a definition of what torture is. What is it?
Well, torture to me, Chuck, is an American citizen on his cell phone making a last call to his 4 young daughters shortly before he burns to death in the upper levels of the Trade Center in New York City on 9/11. There's this notion that somehow there's moral equivalence between what the terrorists did and what we do, and that's absolutely not true. We were very careful to stop short of torture. The Senate has seen fit to label their report torture, but we worked hard to stay short of that definition.
Well, what is that definition?
Definition is the one that was provided by the Office of Legal Counsel. We went specifically to them because we did not want to cross that line into where we were violating some international agreement that we'd signed up to. They specifically authorized and okayed, for example, exactly what we did. All of the techniques that were authorized by the President were, in effect, blessed by the Justice Department opinion that we could go forward to those without, in fact, committing torture.
Let me go through some of those techniques that were used. Majid Khan was then suspected of, was subjected to involuntary rectal feeding and rectal hydration. It included 2 bottles of Ensure. Later in the same day, Majid Khan's lunch tray, consisting of hummus, pasta, sauce, nuts, and raisins, was pureed and rectally infused. Does that meet the definition of torture?
That does not meet the definition of what was used in the program.
I understand that, but does that meet the definition of torture in your mind?
In my mind, I've told you what meets the definition of torture. It's what 19 guys armed with airline tickets and box cutters did to 3,000 Americans on 9/11. What was done here apparently certainly was not one of the techniques that was approved. I believe it was done for medical reasons.
Well, there is no, medical community has said there is no medical reason to do this.
If you go and look, for example, at Jose Rodriguez's book, and he was the guy running the program, right. He's got a very clear description of how, in fact, the program operated. With respect to that, I think the agency has answered it in its response to the committee report.
But you acknowledge this was over and above.
That was not something that was done as part of the interrogation program.
But you won't call it torture?
It wasn't torture in terms of it wasn't part of the program.
Let me ask you this. We've got Rihad al-Najjar. He had handcuffing of both of his wrists to an overhead bar, would not allow him to lower his arms, 22 hours each day for 2 consecutive days in order to break his resistance. Al-Najjar was also wearing a diaper and had no access to toilet facilities. Was that acknowledged? Was that part of your program, the program that you approved?
I can't tell from that specifically whether it was or not. I know.
Page 53 of the report.
The report is seriously flawed. They didn't talk to anybody who knew anything about the program. They didn't talk to anybody who was in the program. The best guide for what, in fact, happened is the one that's the report that was produced by the 3 CIA directors and deputy directors of the CIA when this program was undertaken. And, in fact, it lays out in very clear terms what we did and how we did it. And with respect to trying to define that as torture, I come back to the proposition torture was what the al-Qaeda terrorists did to 3,000 Americans on 9/11. There's no comparison between that and what we did with respect to enhanced interrogation. Simply not true.
But some of these tactics went above and beyond what was approved. Here's another one. Let me read you another one here with Abu Zubaydah. Over a 20-day period, aggressive interrogation, spent a total of 266 hours, 11 days, 2 hours, in a large coffin-sized confinement box, 29 hours in a small confinement box, width of 21 inches, depth of 2.5 feet, height of 2.5 feet. That's on page 42. Is that going to meet the standard definition of torture?
I think that was, in fact, one of the approved techniques. In terms of torture, I guess what I do, I was struck, for example, by the statements by Bud Day and Leo Thorsness and Admiral Denton. These are three folks who were captured by the North Vietnamese, held for years, subject to extreme torture, and all of whom said that waterboarding was not torture. Now, you can look for various definitions. We did what was, in fact, required to make certain that going forward we were not violating the law. And the law, as interpreted by the Justice Department, the Office of Legal Counsel, was very clear. And the techniques that we did, in fact, use, that the President authorized, that produced results, that gave us the information we needed to be able to safeguard the nation against further attacks and to be able to track down those guilty for 9/11, did, in fact, work. Now, the Senate committee, partisan operation, no Republicans involved, no interviews of anybody involved itself.
It's all CIA documentation in here.
Chuck,
it is all CIA
Chuck,
documentation.
if you look at it, and if you look at what the people running the agency said, and what Jose Rodriguez said, who ran the program, was a good man, that, as I said the other day, I won't use the word on your show, it may be family, it's a crock. It's not true. And
have you read more of the report?
I've read parts of it. Not the whole report. Hasn't even been released.
Right, the 6,000, the 500-page. This is the executive summary.
Is a summary. Go read what the directors of the agency said about the report. They were extremely critical of it, as were the Republicans who served on the committee. It's a flawed report. It didn't begin to approach what's required by way of responsible oversight.
Does it plant any seed of doubt in you, though?
No.
No seed of doubt at all?
Absolutely
all of this information in here, no seed of doubt that whether this worked or not?
It worked. It absolutely did work.
Let me ask you, what do you say to Gul Rahman? What do you say to Suleiman Abdallah? What do you say to Khalid al-Masri? All three of these folks were detained. They had these interrogation techniques used on them. They eventually were found to be innocents. They were released. No apologies. Nothing. What do we owe them?
Well,
what does this? I mean, let me go to Gul Rahman. He was chained to the wall of his cell, doused with water, froze to death in CIA custody, and it turned out it was a case of mistaken identity.
Right. But the problem I have is with all the folks that we did release that end up back on the battlefield. Of the 600 and some people who were released out of Guantanamo, 30% roughly ended up back on the battlefield. Today we're very concerned about ISIS, terrible new terrorist organization. It is headed by a named Baghdadi. Baghdadi was in the custody of the U.S. military in Iraq, in Camp Bucca. He was let go, and now he's out leading the terror attack against the United States. I'm more concerned with bad guys who got out and were released than I am with a few that, in fact, were innocent.
25% of the detainees, though, 25% turned out to be innocent. They were
where are you going to draw the line, Chuck? How are you going to know?
Is that too high? Is that you're okay with that margin for
I have no problem as long as we achieve our objective. And our objective is to get the guys who did 9/11, and it is to avoid another attack against the United States. I was prepared, and we did. We got the authorization from the President and authorization from the Justice Department to go forward to the program. It worked. It worked now for 13 years. We've avoided another mass casualty attack against the United States. We did capture bin Laden. We did capture an awful lot of the senior guys of al-Qaeda who were responsible for that attack on 9/11. I'd do it again in a minute.
When you say waterboarding is not torture, then why did we prosecute Japanese soldiers in World War II for waterboarding?
For a lot of stuff, not for waterboarding. They did an awful lot of other stuff to draw some kind of moral equivalent between waterboarding, judged by our Justice Department not to be torture, and what the Japanese did with the Bataan Death March, the slaughter of thousands of Americans, with the rape of Nanking and all of the other crimes they committed. That's an outrage. It's a really cheap shot, Chuck, to even try to draw a parallel between the Japanese who were prosecuted for war crimes after World War II and what we did with waterboarding 3 individuals, all of whom were guilty in participating in the 9/11 attacks.
Is there a reason these interrogations didn't happen on U.S. soil? Was there concern that maybe these folks would get legal protections from the United States, and that's why it was done at black sites? We
didn't read them their Miranda rights either. These are not American citizens. They are unlawful combatants. They are terrorists. They are people who have committed unlawful acts of war against the American people. And we put them in places where we could proceed with the interrogation program and find out what they knew so we could protect the country against further attacks. And it worked.
Let me ask you to respond to John McCain and David Petraeus. General Petraeus said this in 2007 to his troops about these interrogation techniques. Some may argue that we would be more effective if we sanctioned torture or other expedient methods to obtain information from the enemy. That would be wrong. And, of course, here's what Senator McCain said earlier this week.
I know the use of torture compromises that which most distinguishes us from our enemies. Our belief that all people, even captured enemies, possess basic human rights which are protected by international conventions the United States not only joined, but for the most part authored.
Your reaction?
My reaction is the same as Leo Thorsness, who was on the air this week, captured, pilot shot down over Vietnam, held in captivity for many years, subjected to torture, who this week said waterboarding is not torture. He also holds the Medal of Honor, as did Bud Day, who was also captured and tortured and subsequently made it clear that he did not believe waterboarding was torture.
So if an American citizen is waterboarded by ISIS, are we going to try to prosecute ISIS for war crimes?
He's not likely to be waterboarded. He's likely to have his head cut off.
Right. But
not a close call.
If another country captures a U.S. soldier, the Iranian regime, waterboards,
Chuck,
is that going to be an accepted?
You're trying to come up now with hypothetical situations. Waterboarding, the way we did it, was in fact not torture. Now, when you're dealing with terrorists, the likes of Al-Qaeda or the likes of ISIS, I haven't seen them waterboard anybody. What they do is cut their heads off. What they did to 3,000 Americans on 9/11, that was brutal, bloody murder. It's absolutely can't be compared with what we did with respect to our enhanced interrogation program. Now,
there is an implication here that you yourself were misled by the CIA. In particular, it has to do with Jose Padilla. A memo that was prepared for you by the CIA said use of DOJ-authorized enhanced interrogation techniques as part of the comprehensive interrogation program has enabled us to disrupt terrorist plots. Dirty bomb plot. Operatives Jose Padilla and Binyan Mohammed planned to build and detonate a dirty bomb in the Washington, D.C. area. Plot was disrupted, the source with Abu Zubaydah. In this same report 2 pages later, this is what the Senate Democrats found. A review of CIA cables and other CIA records found that the use of the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques played no role in the identification of Jose Padilla or the thwarting of the dirty bomb or the tall buildings plot. Do you feel as if they were telling you what you wanted to hear?
No,
that's the implication here.
Well, the implication is just wrong. And again, the CIA directors make it very clear that they got it wrong time after time after time. The notion that we were not notified at the White House about what was going on is not true. I sat through a lengthy session in 2004 with the Inspector General of the CIA as he reviewed the state of the program at that time. The suggestion, for example, that the president didn't approve it, wrong. That's a lie. That's not true. We were, in fact...
How was he briefed? How was the president
He was briefed
by CIA or by you or by...
I was heavily involved, as was especially the National Security Council, Condi. The president writes about it in his own book.
So you were directly...
His book.
Right. Well, 3 pages into the book, he talks about it, but you were briefed directly. He was briefed indirectly most of the time. Is that fair to say?
That's not fair to say. What happened was he and I met every single morning with the director of the CIA, with the National Security Advisor, 6 days a week, and reviewed everything basically in the intelligence arena. That's where we got most of our information, that and the written PDB. There would be special meetings from time to time on various subjects that he would be directly involved in. This man knew what we were doing. He authorized it. He approved it. A statement by the Senate Democrats for partisan purposes that the president didn't know what was going on is just a flat-out lie.
But
it's a cheap shot piece of political business that was not bipartisan, nor was it involved any discussion with the people involved in the program. Why would you even give that credence?
Well, let me ask you this. Why do you not have some doubt in the CIA? This is the same intelligence community that didn't get it right on WMDs in Iraq. Why are you so confident that they're telling you the truth in these memos?
Well, because I know the people involved, because I've worked 5 out of the 6 former directors and deputy directors are men I've known for years and trust intimately with the difficult problems they've dealt with. Jose Rodriguez is one of the outstanding officers in the agency. I know what they were asked to do, and I know what they did, and I'm perfectly comfortable that they deserve our praise. They deserve to be decorated. They don't deserve to be harassed. Can you imagine what it's going to be like if you were out there now as an officer in the agency and you were undertaking a complicated, difficult, dangerous task, and you have the view that 10 years from now, even though the president approved it, even though the Justice Department signed off on it, some politician on Capitol Hill is going to come back and want a piece of your fanny.
Well,
It's an outrageous proposition that we're going through here, that it's even being discussed.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because here's the United Nations. This is Ben Emerson, Special Envoy on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, and he wants a criminal probe here. This is what he said. It's now time to take action. Individuals responsible, what he calls a criminal conspiracy revealed in the report, must be brought to justice, must face criminal penalties, and then he ends with the U.S. legally is obliged to bring those responsible to justice. I know how you feel in this.
Yeah,
do you think the president should issue a blanket?
I have little respect for the United Nations or for this individual who doesn't have a clue and had absolutely no responsibility for safeguarding this nation or going after the bastards that killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11.
Do you think the president should issue a blanket pardon to CIA agents involved here?
There's no pardon needed. No crime was committed.
But just to
no
make
crime.
Sure?
Who wants to sanction or satisfy some executive at the United Nations who doesn't have any say or responsibility and claim that some kind of pardon is required, Chuck? This is again, I come back to the proposition. One of the things I'm really worried about is what this is doing long term. We're still at war. The terrorist threat out there today is as bad as it was on 9/11. We've got ISIS talking about attacking the United States, having created a caliphate. We're in a situation at least as bad as we had on 9/11, when after the attack we had word that al-Qaeda was trying to acquire nuclear weapons. Now we're sitting here today. We are castigating the CIA for doing what the president ordered them to do and the Justice Department said was legal. We're doing enormous damage to our relationship overseas with our friends and allies who supported us and worked with us. We're making it very, very difficult to be able to go recruit foreign agents to work with us because they're likely to be hung out to dry by politicians on Capitol Hill who've got some kind of political axe to grind. We're in big trouble, partly because of the irresponsible content, is the way I would describe it, with respect to this act, and that the Senate would go forward, the Senate Democrats would go forward, not with a bipartisan approach, not with an approach that takes into account the views of the people who were involved, but goes forward for some political reason, trashing a very, very good program that worked, that saved lives, that kept us from another attack.
All right, let me ask you a couple of quick questions. I want to play for you an interesting clip of you 20 years ago about Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Take a look.
That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far.
By the way, you look good there. Didn't look like as much. Didn't look like 20 years.
How old were you 20 years ago?
I was, what was I? I think I was 22 at the time. Let me ask you this. You could arguably, somebody hearing that today says, boy, that's what Iraq looks like today. Right now, it looks like it might split up. It looks like it's ungovernable. It looks like pieces of Syria and pieces of Iraq are, I mean, everything you described is happening today.
So what's your question?
Well, I guess I ask you, do you regret pushing Saddam Hussein out? Do you regret the Iraq?
No, a lot has
invasion at all?
happened. A lot has happened since between that time 9/11, for example, happened. We got to the point where we were very concerned about the possible linkage between terrorists on the one hand and weapons of mass destruction on the other. Saddam Hussein had previously had twice nuclear programs going. He'd produced and used weapons of mass destruction, and he had a 10-year relationship with al-Qaeda. And all of those things came into play. By the
way, some of the al-Qaeda stuff is questioned in here.
When it was time to get into the business of deciding the importance to go after Iraq, we did the right thing. I believe that it was, in fact, the right action then, and I believe it now.
Last question. Rand Paul or Hillary Clinton? Whose foreign policy are you more comfortable with?
Well, I don't think either one of them is going to be president.
Okay, but you didn't answer the question. Whose foreign policy would you be more comfortable with?
I'm comfortable with my own views, and I've been very forthright about them. And frankly, I don't support either Hillary Clinton or Rand Paul.
How's your health?
Great. I got a new heart almost 3 years ago. I tell my wife my hair's even growing back.
Well, fair enough. Former Vice President Dick Cheney.
Good to see you, Chuck.
Thank you.
You bet.
Well, there you go. We'll be back in 1 minute with a key Democratic member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Ron Wyden.